He wanted a photograph-perfect night. The right partner at the right table, the right smile for the right headlines. The problem was, he had less time than patience and more trouble than charm. William Porter sat on the edge of his leather sofa, the city smeared like wet gold through the windows, and watched a clock on his phone blink a message from the board. Gala, confirmed tonight. His jaw tightened, and the watch on his wrist caught the low light, a small, expensive heartbeat in a house that had never felt quite like home. Across town, in a cramped apartment 3 floors below the penthouse's glass and glare, Daisy Stevens folded a cotton towel with the same careful, automatic motion she'd used for years. Her world smelled of lemon cleaner and coffee gone cold. Stacks of unpaid bills leaned against a stack of textbooks. Among the kitchen clutter sat a well-thumbed business administration notebook, the spine softened from endless notes. She had a degree that nobody had asked about when she was hired to manage linens and run a tidy, discreet household. She had plans that looked like careful maps, but little time to follow them. When the housekeeper met the CEO, neither of them imagined how small changes could tilt the whole room. William had met Daisy 2 weeks earlier when an administrative agency sent her to clear up the master suite. He saw efficiency, a person who could make a cluttered apartment look immaculate in under an hour. She saw details that made his life easier. The files he left on the coffee table, the receipts tucked into pockets, the way his laundry remained exactly when he had no time to address it. A week later, she was back. Not because he had fallen for her, but because he needed a schedule kept, a life managed. Daisy took the job because it paid rent and gave her just enough hours to finish online classes at night. The phone conversation that changed their trajectories was short and awkward, the kind that happens when 2 practical people barter time and obligation. William offered a favor disguised as a proposal. He needed someone to be his date at a charity gala that night, a companion who would appear calm and composed, who would sit on his arm, listen quietly to the right introductions, and not draw attention. He'd pay $5,000 for it, he said, precisely as if the digits could solve whatever had made the board nervous. Daisy listened in the dim light of her kitchenette. The amount was jaw-dropping, $5 grand for a few hours. It would wipe out a quarter of her student loan, cover 3 months' rent, and buy her the security of 1 more semester of online classes. But she didn't take it because she was desperate alone. She took it because curiosity had public hands of its own. She wanted to see the other city, the one where pockets were deep and conversations were transactions. She wanted to hear how people in shirts that cost more than her monthly budget spoke about the world she planned to change. She also set terms. This was not about being invisible. She asked what he expected. Not touching beyond a formal arm, no pretenses that would put her in an uncomfortable position, and a clean, detailed agreement that she was free to leave at any time. William, annoyed and sincere in equal measure, nodded. He wrote the amount on an envelope, slid crisp bills inside, and watched Daisy check each face before she tucked it into her bag. The exchange was a business transaction, plain and simple, 2 adults agreeing to terms. Daisy left with the envelope and a single suit she had borrowed, her stomach a mix of hunger and a curious, cautious thrill. The ballroom for Porter Enterprises' annual gala felt like a different planet. Crystal chandeliers hung like constellations, and the air shimmered with the quiet engine of well-coached small talk, donors' names, compliance wins, philanthropic pledges that mirrored the headlines. William moved through the room with the practiced gait of a man who understood optics. Cameras found him, and his smile was the measured smile of someone who had learned how to sell a face to a room that expected nothing less than perfection. Daisy arrived in a borrowed dress that fit like a quiet promise. She sat at William's table like a character in a play she'd never rehearsed for, listening to talk of revenue targets and board projections, learning quickly where to laugh lightly and where to nod. People in the room assumed she was only decoration, an accessory to William's evening. No one expected the pause that formed when a senior partner at the table, tasting his own importance, spoke as if he were delivering a verdict about people like Daisy. You know how they always say loyalty is priceless? Some of us are fortunate enough to afford that luxury, he said, voice butter smooth. Stability tastes better when it comes with a proper pedigree. The room chuckled, not unkindly. That was the moment Daisy could have stayed silent and been applauded for being charmingly demure. She could have been exactly what the money bought, a still face holding a drink. Instead, she tilted her chin and answered, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that felt like a small bell ringing in a dark room. Stability isn't a luxury, she said. It's a return on investment people forget to calculate. When a company cares for the people who make it run, the ones who answer the phones, who ship the packages, who keep records accurate, the work improves. Customers notice. Turnover drops. Productivity goes up. You can measure respect in retention numbers. There was a faint ripple, the kind of silence that follows a comment out of step with the rest of the script. Heads turned. The senior partner blinked as if someone had replaced the conversation with a live wire. William's smile thinned. He looked at Daisy and then at the table, as if trying to find the camera crew that would explain why things had gone off script. Mr. Moretti watched from across the room. He had the posture of a man who'd made a career of listening for anomalies, people who said the wrong things for the right reasons. Moretti was a senior executive with a reputation for spotting talent where others saw nothing but background noise. He approached Daisy at the end of the speech like a man who had been searching for a missing page. "You have a good head for metrics," he said quietly, not intrusive so much as pleasantly curious, "and an even better way of turning them into plain English. Tell me, do you have experience in employee engagement?" Daisy hesitated a beat before answering. She had a degree and an internship with a nonprofit that had taught her surveys and basic analytics. She had nights of spreadsheets on a laptop burned by old coffee. She had interviews where she heard the same question, why housekeeping? Tonight's audience was not asking that. Moretti offered more than a flattering question. "I'm not asking you to perform a miracle," he said. "If you're willing, I can make a call. We're about to start a new program focused on retention and frontline training. If you'd consider it, we'll set up a meeting with HR." William's hand tightened hermetically around his glass. He had offered money to make people accept an image. He had not budgeted for anyone to dismantle that image from within the frame. His instinct was to erase the ripple. He leaned in, politely, dangerously, and murmured that they should move on, that these matters weren't topics for the table tonight. Daisy looked from William to Moretti and back. She could feel the weight of the envelope in her bag like a small, constant pulse. She could take Moretti's vague offer and walk into an office where nobody had watched her make a valedictory speech between courses. She could say yes to a position that would take months to prove itself. Or she could leave it and let the $5,000 pay a few bills and smooth the rough edges of the next quarter. Agency was not a dramatic gesture for Daisy. It was a ledger of small choices. She took Moretti's card. "I'll meet him," she said, "on Monday." The rest of the night blurred into polite applause and curated smiles. Reporters angled for photos. William introduced Daisy to a set of colleagues who treated her like an accessory and then acted surprised when she spoke about equity and KPIs in the same breath. At one point, someone in his circle made a joke about appearances, and William, trying to reclaim control of the narrative, offered Daisy another envelope. This one thicker, more persuasive, the number not spoken but implied by the weight of paper. After the gala, the hallway felt colder than the ballroom had. The city's lights hit the marble and turned it into something indifferent. William's eyes had the sharpness of a man who had been blindsided. That night, the room had recorded a truth he hadn't budgeted for, that the people running his company's day-to-day life could articulate its soul more honestly than any PR memo. He tried the strategy that had served him well in other embarrassments. He sent a text with a polite, practical tone. He would increase the payment, an offer to help her financially, a promise of something she could not refuse if she was sensible. When that didn't work, he left a check at her apartment door later that week, sealed, direct, and labeled with an extra line he called interest, perhaps as a way of punishing the inequity of her refusal. She returned the check. She left a clean note. She appreciated his generosity, but she would not be bought. Her choices were not for sale. Mr. Moretti, true to his word, called on Monday and set the meeting with HR. He was a man who understood that true disruption rarely came from the top. He wanted someone who could translate frontline frustrations into a language executive boards respected. Daisy, who had snackable data and a different kind of cred than the usual applicants, found herself in a small conference room on the 9th floor, her palms slightly cold against her folder of carefully printed notes. Jennifer entered the room with the brisk efficiency of someone who handled transformations more than egos. She was the HR director, practical, unshowy, quick to smile but quicker to get things done. Her first question wasn't about Daisy's housekeeping. It was about what Daisy saw when she looked at an organization. What worked, what didn't, who was invisible, and why. Daisy spoke plainly. She outlined trends she'd noticed in survey results as a volunteer intern, how a simple change in scheduling practices could reduce missed shifts, and how small investments in training could cut call center complaints significantly. She presented a modest projection. A pilot program could, over 6 months, reduce turnover by nearly 10% and improve first response customer ratings by a measurable margin. She used numbers and examples, anecdotes about people she had met as a housekeeper, call center employees with college degrees stashed away because of unaddressed childcare problems, night shift workers who learned nothing about upward mobility. Jennifer listened, eyes tracking a whiteboard behind Daisy. When she finished, the HR director nodded. "We don't often get unvarnished input from the field," she said. "We get surveys, we get focus groups that we themselves design. What you're offering, an honest look from someone who's been in different stations, that's valuable." The offer was practical. A 6-month pilot within the HR department, an hourly salary that would not match the $5,000 night, but would build a resume she could not buy. Jennifer also explained the guardrails. No immediate authority over hiring decisions, no unilateral changes without oversight, and an expectation of clear data reporting. Daisy welcomed the structure. She told herself quietly that she valued mentorship and legitimacy more than short-term cash. This new role required a quiet bravery. It meant that, for the first time, Daisy was stepping into a world where her ideas would be evaluated on spreadsheets and board agendas rather than her ability to make a bed perfectly. It meant staying at a table longer than a single night and asking for space to speak in rooms where the podium belonged to others. William's reaction to the news was a slow burn. At first, there was a practical irritation. This was not how a controlled narrative unfolded. No one had told him that the ripple of a remark would lead to a meeting in HR. He arranged private conversations, tried to restate the terms of his relationship with Daisy as if reminding her of what had been agreed upon would dissolve the consequences of her choice. He suggested a stipend to recast the public memory. Daisy declined. For every offer William made, for every envelope he left with more than money, flowers, favors, people who wanted to replace her voice with silence, she invoked the quiet ledger in her head, choice, purpose, and the work she actually wanted to do. The first weeks in HR were small victories and soft friction. Daisy learned how to turn conversations into charts, mapping reasons employees left, building a spreadsheet that correlated tenure with predictable schedule conflicts, and interviewing staff across departments to gather stories that numbers alone could not tell. She recruited a team, people who had patience and a knack for follow-through. Thomas, a data analyst with a gentle persistence. Linda, a training coordinator who could make a slow learner look competent in a day. Patrick, an operations supervisor who had a nose for inefficiency. They were not glamorous names on a press release, but they were effective, and Daisy gathered them around a concept she could explain in plain terms. If you treat the people keeping the company running like a liability, you get a liability. If you treat them like an asset and measure it, your balance sheet will reflect that. There were enemies in the form of skepticism. Board members who prized quarterly gains sniffed at any idea that asked for patience. Senior executives who had carved reputations out of ruthlessness called Daisy's proposals soft. She would not pretend there were not moments when she considered using the $5,000 as a buffer against the scorn of a world that discounted her degree as a neat aside beneath her job title. Instead, she kept meticulous notes, built a pilot plan that required a modest budget, less than a single underperforming marketing campaign, and pitched it as risk-managed improvement. William watched the proposal with a mixture of curiosity and calculus. He could not deny the early signs. The call center's first response rate was edging up, and the small changes in scheduling cut into costly overtime. Daisy's team was producing metrics, crisp and anonymized, that spoke in the language executives respected. Still, that didn't make the idea palatable. His instinct was to measure loyalty in terms of returns. He had been trained to take measured risks, to value efficiency above sentiment. Daisy's campaign asked him to look at the human side and measure it. Between the pilot's early setup and the momentum of small wins, Daisy found moments to breathe. She and her small team spent long evenings cross-referencing interviews, listening to employees' stories, and translating them into initiatives. A midday shift reallocation that let single parents keep their jobs. A mentorship program pairing experienced agents with newer hires. A recognition system that cost pennies but changed workplace tone. Matthew, the board member who had joked earlier, made a pointed remark in a meeting about optics and the company's bottom line. "People don't build brands for sentiment," he said. "We build them for profit." Daisy replied quietly, "People build brands without sentiment and wonder why the house burns down, because the ones who carry the weight aren't given water." Her words landed like pebbles in a puddle, small, making circles. William, who by then had grown used to reading the room as a market to be influenced, found himself reading Daisy differently. He began to notice habits rather than headlines. The way she read a spreadsheet for narrative before numbers. The way she folded sentences when explaining a problem to a group. The way she refused shortcuts. For someone who measured risk in margins, there was something in Daisy's approach that felt effective. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was practical. He admired it reluctantly, as one admires a chess move that forces you to revise your strategy. Their relationship shifted in increments, the kind that a boardroom might notice only in hindsight. It began with pointed disagreements in closed meetings and moved toward an exchange of ideas late into the night. They argued about budget allocations and about the worth of small investments in people. She pushed for a structured pilot. He pushed back, asking for hard stop dates and measurable ROI. She negotiated. He compromised. Both were learning to recalibrate what power meant in a company that did not only sell products, but also relied on the dignity of those who produced them. Outside the windows of Porter Enterprises' glass facade, the city moved on, indifferent to personal transformations. Inside, small changes accumulated into momentum. Daisy's pilot had its early skeptics, but it also produced early data, a modest but undeniable reduction in attrition, and a slight bump in customer satisfaction. Those were numbers the finance team could not ignore. One night, as Daisy walked through the quiet of the office building after another round of interviews, she found a check on her desk. It was not the kind of check given in boardrooms or announced in press releases. This one had a familiar hand and a notation that read, "For the trouble." The amount was larger than the original $5,000. The word interest was stamped, as if to mock the idea that money could buy memory. She folded the paper precisely the way she had folded towels for years. She left the check on her desk. A knot in her stomach told her there would be more offers, more attempts to buy quiet. But so far, each time William tried to pay for a story to stay closed, she chose a different currency: time, credibility, work. The pilot was formalized with a modest budget and guarded expectations. Daisy assembled a short, practical presentation: baseline numbers, proposed interventions, timeline, and a request for a minimal expenditure broken down into categories. She submitted the plan to the Oversight Committee: Jennifer, Mr. Moretti, one skeptical senior vice president, and William in the corner, eyes unreadable. The committee didn't hand her a crown. They gave her constraints: a 3-month check-in and a probability range that suggested success, but nothing conclusive. It was enough. It was also terrifying. That night, as the city blinked and the top floors hummed with late-night air conditioning, Daisy sat at a small table in her apartment. The envelope with the first $5,000 sat on a shelf, no longer a secret prize, but an anachronism. The check William had left still lay folded, a small test she had decided to fail on principle. She opened her laptop, flipped through the slides she'd made, and texted her team a simple message: "Tomorrow we start." It was a beginning that felt fragile and fierce all at once. In the hours that followed, William sat alone in his office and reread the meeting minutes. He had lost the immediate advantage of the night at the gala. He had been outmaneuvered by a woman he had thought of as a temporary convenience. He had tried to smooth things over with money and found that some things weren't for purchase. Pride stung him, the acknowledgement that competence had come from an unexpected source. For the first time in a long while, he considered an idea that made his mouth tighten: that strength in leadership could mean fixing systems rather than just defending them. He sent a terse email to Jennifer: "Monitor the pilot closely. No favoritism. I'll recuse myself from direct oversight." She replied with an affirmation that had a hint of dry humor in it: "Noted. We'll keep it empirical." That sentence, "I'll recuse myself," was a small, private surrender that carried a weight Daisy couldn't yet see. It was also a choice William would have to live with, and one that made his nights longer. The next morning, Daisy walked into Porter Enterprises' lobby with a small, practical bag and a big, careful hope. The security desk beeped her ID and the elevator hummed upward, glass doors swallowing the city noise. She thought of her mother's voice saying, "You must be able to stand in 2 rooms, where you came from and where you want to go." She thought of the 1,000 small decisions that had led here: refusing to be bought, folding a towel 20,000 times until its corners were perfect, asking for terms and sticking to them. When the elevator doors opened on the 9th floor, she was met by a bustle of people who had already begun their day. She was shown to a modest workstation, given a clear brief, and introduced to the handful of people who would help her turn pilot into practice. Thomas logged into an analytics dashboard and nudged a file across to her. Linda handed her a manual for the training sessions. Patrick nodded, as if trusting the work more than the person who proposed it. William watched from his glass office with a balance of skepticism and a strange, grudging admiration. He had offered money for a moment of appearance, and instead he had sparked a movement that might change his company. He had tried to pay silence and found none. Now, months from the gala, the man who had given $5,000 to secure an illusion found himself forced to consider a realignment that required more than money: time, listening, and commitment. The elevator doors closed behind Daisy, and she was on the floor, the building's hum settling into an ordinary rhythm. Her phone buzzed once, a message from an unknown number that read simply, "Don't forget, this is your pilot. Make it count." She smiled without knowing who had written it, perhaps Moretti, perhaps Jennifer, and it felt like the wind at her back. At her little desk, she opened the spreadsheet and felt the strange, steady pulse of possibility. Around her, voices rose: a clerk citing a schedule, a supervisor making a note about a shift swap. The pilot program would not be a magic fix. It would be a series of small, measurable wins. One change in a rota, one training session, one recognition award at a time. It would also be a test of whether a company that had thrived on polished images could succeed when people were treated as assets with measurable returns. She began by calling employees, listening not for sound bites but for patterns. She wrote down answers meticulously, then translated them into a model the board would understand. Each row in her spreadsheet was a person's story, reduced to numbers and notes.
Childcare conflicts, commute times, lack of cross-training, no path for part-time employees who wanted full-time opportunities. She sketched solutions, small and concrete, staggered start times, shift flexibility for caregivers, a mentor match program, and a recognition program publicized on the company intranet.
As the day ended, Daisy walked out of the building into an evening that had once felt like a different life. The street had changed little. The city always moved in steady rhythms. She reached into her bag and touched the envelope with the $5,000, now folded into a corner of her notebook, not as temptation, but as a marker of choice. Money had been the way in, but work, she reminded herself, was the way forward. Behind her, not even a floor apart, William closed a late-night file and stared at his own reflection in the glass of his office. There was no neat resolution to what had begun as a purchased evening of appearances. The company had shifted, just enough for something fragile to begin. He felt both the risk and the possibility of being part of that change. That sense, an unfamiliar, unnerving softening, was the kind of thing that made boardrooms dangerous for men who preferred certainty. He placed a hand on the cool glass and watched the city below. Outside, the night flowed on. Inside, a modest spreadsheet flickered with numbers that promised a different kind of return. Daisy had accepted a date for $5,000. No one in the room knew then that 3 months, a pilot, and a handful of modest changes could redraw the future of a company built on appearances. No one yet knew how William would manage his pride when it came to measurement and people, or how their slow mutual respect might become something more complicated. The first week passed. Early metrics were promising enough to get murmurs and uneasy eyebrows across cubicles. The pilot required presentations and constant refinement. Daisy learned to turn stories into slides and anecdotes into charts. She and Jennifer met with finance to justify expenditures. Mr. Moretti came by once to observe, and his notes were precise. Look for sustainability in the model, watch for bias in selection. In the margins of all this, William sent messages that vacillated between terse and curious. They did not always align with Daisy's instincts for patient change. He spoke the language of speed and scale. She spoke the language of patience and dignity. Where he wanted quick wins, she wanted durable systems. The tension was not explosive. It was the small, persistent friction that makes steel tough. It would shape what came next. The pilot's first visible success, the grudging respect that edged toward friendship, and the set of choices that would force both of them to reckon with the idea that power could be shared without disappearing. At the end of a long Thursday, after a series of interviews and a small town hall meeting where employees finally felt heard, Daisy sent a short update to her team. The subject line read, "Small wins, big work." She listed the changes they'd implemented, the numbers that improved, and the next steps. Her final line had the careful warmth of someone used to being underestimated. "We're not done, but we're getting there." She hit send. Then she turned her attention to the next week's list. Meetings, training modules, a presentation to the oversight committee that, if the numbers held, convince more skeptical board members that investing in people was investing in product. Across the hall, William read the email and found himself smiling despite himself. It was a small, private thing. He had offered money for an image and received a movement instead. He had miscalculated. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps being wrong was the beginning of learning. The city outside did not change its course. The gala had passed. The envelope had been folded and set aside. But the work had only just begun, and for Daisy, William, and the company, the first honest steps had already been taken toward a different horizon. The first year after the gala felt, in equal measure, like a slow climb and a series of small, decisive steps. Wins accumulated the way coins gather in a pocket, unnoticed until you reach in and find the weight. Daisy learned to measure momentum the same way she had learned to fold towels. Attention to corners, repetition, finishing clean. The pilot widened from a handful of teams to 2 regional centers. Metrics that had once been a glinting hope on a single spreadsheet became rows and columns that executives could not ignore. Tell us the city you're watching from. The message was small and human. Daisy preferred the work itself to anything that looked like applause. Still, the boardroom began to buzz with language that implied permanence. 6 months in, the pilot had delivered a 9% reduction in turnover in participating units, trimming hiring and onboarding costs by a figure the finance team could quote without wincing, roughly $1.2 million annually when extrapolated to company scale. First response customer ratings had improved by 8 percentage points. Internal surveys showed a measurable uptick in employee engagement scores. These were not miraculous numbers. They were the results of staggered shifts, a modest childcare stipend, a mentor program that paired experienced frontline staff with new hires, and a recognition program that cost less than a single external marketing campaign. They were proof that the ledger Daisy had promised could be balanced. Thomas became the quiet hero of the dashboards. He could take a messy log of exit interviews and extract the pattern that made the board take notice: a cluster of departures tied to inflexible scheduling and transit times. Linda turned her training modules into short, repeatable sessions that could be recorded and scaled across centers. Patrick reworked a fulfillment line so that overtime declined and holiday surges were handled with temporary cross-training rather than emergency hires. The team's victories were modular and boring and therefore believable. Not everyone celebrated. A faction on the board, led by Matthew, favored rapid expansion and the blunt arithmetic of quarterly growth. They called Daisy's approach soft and slow. When Matthew spoke, his tone carried the small cruelty of someone who believed that kindness was a variable in an equation to be minimized. He liked tidy problems with clean, immediate solutions. Daisy, when she heard that tone, did what she had done at the Gala: she translated sentiment into numbers. In a meeting that condensed months of work into a single hour, she presented attrition curves, cost analyses, and projected scenarios. She showed an anonymized sample of employee testimonials, short video clips that a few staff had recorded voluntarily after the mentor program launched. One woman who had been a night shift supervisor for 7 years talked about the difference that predictable shifts had made for her ability to enroll her child in daycare. Another young dispatcher explained how a public recognition on the company intranet had made her team feel seen. Daisy kept the videos short and the data crisp. She closed with a concrete ask: a controlled rollout to an additional 4 centers over the next 9 months with clearly defined KPIs and a finance checkpoint at 6 months. The room, for once, was not theatrical. It listened. Moretti, who had watched Daisy from the start with a habit of quiet appraisal, nodded. Jennifer, who had become her closest ally inside, took the next slide and explained oversight mechanisms. Even Matthew, though he still muttered about time to value, could not argue with the arithmetic when shown the cost of replacing a trained agent multiplied across hundreds of departures. William sat in the corner, folded like a sentence that had yet to find its clause. He admired that meeting because it was efficient. He admired it less because it had happened without his design. His posture had changed over months from defense to curiosity to a private, awkward appreciation. He began dropping by group stand-ups once a week, quietly, without announcements, to hear stories not designed for press releases. He listened to Thomas explain a statistic. He watched Daisy organize a training session with Linda. He began to ask questions about scale and sustainability rather than optics. The shift in him was not cinematic. It was not a swath of sudden altruism. It was incremental. A recusal turned into an offer of resources. Skepticism turned into the occasional late-night email asking for an explanation of a chart. The change that mattered most, and the one that would ripple later, was his willingness to let the work be led by those who understood its details. The romance between Daisy and William did not arrive as a blow of passion. It was a collection of soft edges. It started with late conversations about logistics and spilled over into lunches where they argued about the right order of implementing a mentorship program. There were moments of friction. She resented what she called the envelope history, and he wrestled with the pride that had led him to believe money could solve 100 problems. They clashed like engineers over a blueprint, and, slowly, learned to listen without trying to redraw the other's lines. Their first shared private meal was not cinematic either. It was a late dinner near the office, at a small table with food meant to be eaten with forks rather than props. They talked about family histories, Daisy about a mother who worked double shifts, and named ambition not as a villain but as a survival mode. William about a father who had taught him that the company always came first because that was how family security had been paid for. They spoke with a kind of guarded honesty that made each of them surprised at their own vulnerability. Neither wanted an affair that would undermine the work. They knew where disaster could come from: the whispered accusation of favoritism or the suspicion that public narrative had steamrolled private merit. So one evening, after a conversation that had started with scheduling logistics and ended with mutual confession about sleeplessness, they sat down in William's office and outlined a set of rules that felt like a contract of trust. "We tell HR," Daisy said plainly. "We recuse from staffing decisions where there's a direct conflict. We won't meet privately about budgets that affect my portfolio without a third person in the room." William clasped his hands. "I'll step back from oversight on your pilot," he said. "I'll sign a disclosure to the board. If we move forward personally, I'll recuse from any performance evaluation and voting where there's a direct interest." They wrote down the rules on a notepad and took a photo. It wasn't romantic in the cinematic sense. It was careful and adult and structured like the kind of agreement Daisy had learned in business school. Jennifer, when told, offered a wry smile and then arranged for an independent ombudsperson to be involved if their relationship became public. The professional boundaries were explicit. The affection between them, when it grew, did so within those parameters. Their first publicly noticed display of warmth came at a charity dinner for a community training initiative the company supported. The event was more public than William liked and more sincere than Daisy expected. They were seated at the same table, their conversation less guarded, and in a quieter moment after the program's speakers had gone, a lingering compliment, on a point of policy of all things, turned into a tentative brush of hands. It was brief, consensual, and visible enough to invite a hint of speculation in the room, but careful enough to show restraint. Later that night, as they walked through a side garden, a quick, deliberate kiss happened. An image that made both of them smile and then check their watch, as if to prove they were still both responsible people. Romance did not become a cloak that hid the hard work. It threaded through long hours and dashboards. It sat in on training sessions, sometimes as a spectator that shared a coffee. People noticed, not because they were flashy, but because two senior figures who had argued like competitors now found ways to laugh together in the hallway. Staff speculated, and there were whispers, but Daisy's work had given her the kind of credibility that rumors could not easily dismantle. The company, meanwhile, grew in complexity. Just as Daisy's programs edged toward broader adoption, a prospect presented itself that tested everything the company claimed to value. A global competitor, Avalon Systems, a multinational with deeper pockets and a history of absorbing smaller firms, made an approach. The terms were clean on paper: acquisition at a generous premium, synergies promised, a cost structure that could recast margins for the board. To many on the finance side, this was the kind of strategic move that made headlines and justified tenure. To others, it threatened the company's identity, the decentralized culture, the people-centered operations that had become Porter Enterprises' growing edge. The proposal reached the boardroom like an instrument landing with a countdown. The due diligence teams called for a 3-week timetable to assess the merger's viability. If they accepted, the company would deliver a report and a recommendation. If they rejected, the alternative would be to remain independent and accelerate Daisy's programs. The stakes were immediate. Layoffs were discussed in quiet side conversations as a necessary evil of consolidation. Daisy sat in the room when Moretti and the CEO of Avalon presented their preliminary pitch. Avalon's representatives were polished, fluent in the language of scale. They showed a creed of models and redundancy plans that cut costs by consolidating operations.
They promised integration frameworks and efficiency metrics that seemed almost mathematical. Remove overlap, centralize procurement, streamline centers. In their model, the human costs were a figure on a slide, one that made the finance team's mouths form consonant sounds of simple arithmetic. When the meeting adjourned, there was a kind of hush. The board's chair called for a short recess, and the room divided into camps. Some saw instant value. Others, like Jennifer and Moretti, worried aloud that integration would mean the dismantling of frontline programs, not intentionally, but inevitably as layers were consolidated. Daisy felt the weight of numbers and people come together like the slam of closing pages. She knew what the merger would mean for the very employees who had made the pilot's numbers possible. She also knew the argument the board would hear first, that money on paper would outweigh qualitative testimonies. William listened and, at a low volume, asked a simple question that refracted the entire issue.
"Can we quantify what identity loss would cost over 3 years?" he asked. It was not the kind of question one saw on a merger slide, but it did the job of focusing the conversation on long-term value rather than immediate realized expense. The company set a short, brutal timeline, 3 weeks to produce a defense case for independence or accept the acquisition offer. It was the kind of pressure cooker Daisy had seen in movies and, as it turned out, in reality. They had to sketch out a plan that married financial viability with culture preservation. In essence, they had to show the board that the company's people-first approach was not sentimental, but scalable and profitable. Daisy convened her team and carved the work into 2 streams. One stream, led by Thomas and Patrick, would produce financial scenarios, a forecast that translated reduced turnover and improved customer retention into a revenue impact across 3 years. The second stream, led by Linda and Jennifer, would collect human evidence, recorded employee testimonials, documented cost of turnover analyses, and case studies from pilot centers showing productivity upticks. Moretti, who had the ear of several skeptical members, offered access to insights about integrating culturally aligned processes into corporate scaffolding. He insisted on conservative assumptions, no inflated projections, no heroic multipliers. They worked with consultants for a few days to stress test assumptions. Thomas's models were precise. With the pilot's adoption across the core network, attrition could be reduced company-wide by an average of 10 to 12% within 18 months. When translated into hiring cost reduction, productivity continuity, and training savings, the firm could preserve an estimated $3.6 million in net operational costs over 3 years against the acquisition's promised one-time premium. The consultants pushed back on optimism and asked for sensitivity analyses. Thomas produced them, best case, worst case, and a conservative baseline. The numbers still favored independence, but they were not immune to skepticism. Daisy's team also prepared a human narrative. They compiled a folder of short, voluntary testimonials from employees who had benefited from the mentor program and the scheduling reforms. They assembled a few families' stories, people who had kept their jobs while continuing education, caregivers who no longer missed work because of shift flexibility, a mid-level supervisor whose morale had been restored by public recognition and then translated into improved team performance. They filmed a small, unglamorous montage of customer service calls before and after training modules, a measurable drop in escalations, and an audible shift in tone. The evidence was earnest, not staged. The 3-week push was exhausting. There were late nights and boardroom rehearsals, and William, who had publicly taken himself out of direct oversight on Daisy's program, found ways to be useful without overstepping. He introduced the team to analysts who could lend weight to their financial scenarios. He ensured that the legal team had the right language to protect employee contracts. And he opened doors for a final presentation that needed to feel seamless. On the second week, a PR leak suggested that Avalon's offer would be presented as a fait accompli if the board stalled. The rumor added pressure. Matthew used it as leverage in a private conversation, suggesting that delaying the offer could undermine shareholder value. There were tense exchanges in which the algebra of risk clashed with the ethics of identity. Daisy felt the room tilt under the weight of decimal points. In the final week, in preparation for the decisive board meeting, Daisy rehearsed her section of the presentation until she could say every phrase without the brittle edge that uncertainty brings. She felt the old, familiar pressure of being under a spotlight, but this time the stakes were the whole company, not the dignity of a single night at a gala. She asked Moretti to stand beside her. He agreed without fanfare. Jennifer organized an oversight of the Q&A session to ensure the board's concerns would be addressed systematically. Thomas prepared a one-sheet of the 3-year savings projection. Linda curated the human montage. Patrick set up a live feed so that 2 employees from pilot sites could speak briefly to the board, unmediated. The morning of the presentation, the boardroom looked like a theater of consequence. Avalon's offer sat on the table like a polished instrument. The external analysts, sober, pleasant, sat like referees. Daisy felt the low hum of adrenaline in her palm. She thought of the gala, of the envelope, of the folded checks that had once tried to buy silence. She thought of the mother who'd once told her to stand in both rooms, where you came from and where you want to go. She straightened her notes and walked to the front. Her opening was not a speech meant to charm. It was a ledger. She began with the numbers, attrition percentages, customer response shifts, incremental revenue tied to improved retention. She explained, in plain terms, how a 10% reduction in turnover translated into a steady cost saving and uninterrupted institutional knowledge that would improve service reliability. She did not grandstand. She spoke like someone who had sat in call centers and heard employees' reasons articulated in tones that were not on any slide. Then she switched registers. The board had asked for a human proof point, so Daisy cut to the montage Linda had assembled.
In 30 seconds, the room moved from charts to faces. A dispatcher who could now support night school, a warehouse lead who had reduced errors because training ensured continuity, a teammate who described feeling seen for the first time in a decade. The testimonials were modest. They were not manipulative. They were, as one skeptical analyst later described, data with a pulse. Moretti closed their portion by outlining the integration framework they would propose should the board choose independence. A conservative rollout of Daisy's model with external audits at 6, 12, and 18 months. A finance checkpoint with contingency plans, and a public commitment to preserving frontline autonomy where possible. The package was practical. It recognized the need for efficiency without dissolving identity. Avalon's pitch, for all its polish, could not answer an obvious question. Who would sustain the morale that had produced these gains if the company were subsumed into a central structure designed for scale? Their reply was that culture could be absorbed. Their slides suggested that integration could be respectful. The board, however, had to weigh the intangible risk of losing morale against the one-time cash benefit. The vote was not a landslide. It was a deliberative, anxious process. Matthew argued for the short-term premium. A few institutional investors spoke in favor of immediate value. But Moretti's conservatism and Daisy's evidence, underpinned by Thomas's conservative financials, won a narrow majority. The board voted to retain independence and adopt a staged expansion of Daisy's program with measurable oversight and contingency triggers. The motion passed. When the resolution was announced, the room released a collective breath. There was applause, but it was not theatrical. It was relief translated into sound. For Daisy, it felt like something heavy unlatched. Moretti gave her a short, approving nod. Jennifer hugged her at the side of the conference table as if they had just won a small, essential battle. William watched from his chair with a look that had no name. It was both pride and the recognition that his world of balance sheets and titles had shifted. He stood and crossed the room. "You did the thing you do," he said, less formal than he had ever been. "You translated people into something the board could understand." Daisy, who had rehearsed 10,000 ways of answering triumph and doubt, smiled. "We did the thing together," she said, "and we did it in a way that keeps people whole." The applause that followed felt for once deserved. In the hallway, after the meeting, when the champagne corks had not yet popped and the city below was just a smear of evening lights, William took Daisy's hand. He did not reach for an envelope, he reached for a ring. He had rehearsed the moment a dozen times in his head and then threw out every version. There was no speech prepared. He found 2 sentences.
"You refused to be bought," he said simply. "You turned an uncomfortable night into the company's future. Will you marry me?" Daisy's first instinct was practical. To clarify logistics, to remember the rules they had written, to ask about conflict of interest. Then she let herself be surprised. She remembered the towels folded with care, the nights of spreadsheets, the envelope folded into a notebook, money as a doorway, not a destination. She also remembered choosing work and choosing honesty. She thought of William's recusal and the way he had learned to listen. "Yes," she said. The word was a decision, and in it lived months of labor and a future she would now help shape. They negotiated the future the way they had negotiated the present, with transparency. They disclosed the engagement to HR immediately. They formalized a plan for how they would avoid conflicts at work. William agreed to step entirely out of the oversight of any function she led. Daisy agreed to involve Jennifer as a formal reviewer on decisions that might create the appearance of favoritism. They signed a simple disclosure and asked the board to approve the recusal arrangements. The board appreciated the honesty. It helped that Daisy's program had just been validated. The wedding was small by industry standards, but unpretentious in a way that mattered to both of them. They married in the town hall that had been the scene of Daisy's early volunteer work. Friends from her pilot, people whose promotions had been quietly facilitated by the mentorship program, attended. William's family sent a small bouquet and a recorded message that expressed pride and an apology for slow emotional growth. Moretti stood in the back with a discreet smile. Jennifer read a short paragraph about the value of steady, patient work. They danced to a playlist Daisy had made that included songs from her kitchen radio and a track William had once hummed while reviewing projections. It was nothing like a gala. It was better. It was a gathering of people who mattered. After the wedding, they founded a small philanthropic initiative. First, a program within Porter Enterprises, and then, a year later, an independent foundation, dedicated to recognizing and developing overlooked talent. The Foundation for Frontline Opportunity focused on scholarships, microgrants for childcare support, and partnerships with community colleges. Daisy led the foundation's advisory council, and William donated an initial endowment. Instead of press statements brimming with glossy language, they chose a simple model: small grants, measurable outcomes, and a commitment to transparency about who received funds and why. Their approach to the foundation mirrored the careful, methodical work that had saved the company. They tracked graduates, measured post-grant employment stability, and published annual reports that showed impact in tangible terms: numbers, stories, and an honest accounting of failures. Some projects missed their marks. They refined, learned, and adjusted. The foundation's early success was not a meteoric rise, but a steady, meaningful increase in opportunities for those who might otherwise have been invisible to executive talent scouts. Years marched on. The company did not become perfect overnight, but it changed in ways that mattered. Employee churn continued to decline across the board as Daisy's programs were scaled with fidelity and oversight. The mentorship system became a recognized pipeline for mid-level management. Portfolios that had once been experimental were now standard practice in several departments. The company's reputation shifted from a brand that relied on optics to one that could point to documented human outcomes and sustained financial health. 5 years after the night that began with an envelope slid across a table, the foundation hosted a gala of its own. The room was purposefully different from the Porter Enterprises gala, less about polished appearances and more about people and stories. The attendees included scholarship recipients, community leaders, longtime staff, and a few executives who had once opposed Daisy's ideas and now, to their credit, could speak about the impact in a voice that lacked embarrassment.
There were speeches, yes, and there were short films showing where funds had gone, a technical school that installed a new lab for night students, a childcare co-op that allowed a cohort of employees to upgrade to full-time roles. Daisy stood at the podium in a simple dress and looked out across the room. The chandeliers glittered, but what she saw was not the best table or the most polished suit. She saw faces that had been part of a long and patient work. She told a story, brief, human, about a woman who had once been a night shift supervisor and had, thanks to a small grant, enrolled in a management program that led to a promotion. She told the story plainly. She did not inflate it. The room listened. Moretti, who had aged into a different kind of patience, watched from the back with the same thoughtful look he had the night he first offered her a meeting. William stood beside Daisy at the end of the event. They walked through the crowd holding hands, restrained, acknowledged, visible not as spectacle, but as partners in a durable project. Later, as they posed for a photograph behind a modest banner for the foundation, William leaned in and said something small that made Daisy laugh. "You still fold towels better than most of our operations managers," he teased. She smiled, a warm, quiet reply. "Someone has to keep the corners sharp." The Gala's after-party was filled with the kind of quiet conversations that change trajectories. Mentors connecting with students, donors asking for ways to scale proven models, board members taking notes. Outside, the city spread like a familiar map. Inside, the foundation's work felt less like a headline and more like a method of practice.
Daisy's life had not become a fairy tale. There were moments of fatigue and setbacks, and the relentless accounting that came with leadership. There were nights when the spreadsheets did not balance, and mornings when the human stories were too many to adequately track. But her choices, accepting the date under terms she set, refusing to be bought, stepping into work with a degree and a plan, had led to a life that was decidedly, stubbornly hers. The company continued to be a place of tension between short-term profits and long-term stewardship. That tension was no longer a scandal. It was the medium in which policy and principle were negotiated. Daisy's influence reshaped processes without erasing the market's demands. William's evolution from a man who thought of purchase as the primary lever of influence to one who saw investment in people as strategic was not a redemption arc in a novel. It was a pragmatic reorientation that made financial sense and moral sense at once. At home, their conversations were not about the headlines, but about logistics, school applications, foundation budgets, the occasional laundry mishap that made them both laugh. They maintained the rules they had written in the early days. William continued to recuse himself where necessary. Daisy kept Jennifer as an institutional check. They had learned how to love without erasing each other's professional seriousness. Years later, as Daisy walked through a training center that had once been slated for closure, she paused by a wall where students had put up a mural. The painting showed silhouettes of people holding hands and stepping up a staircase. A small plaque had been added. "Opportunity is folded into the corners." Daisy touched the plaque and remembered a towel, a folded envelope, an evening that had changed a company and many lives. She thought of the way one small choice, refusing to be bought and choosing instead to invest labor into a public argument, had ripple effects she could not have predicted. The foundation continued to grow in sensible increments. It funded a transportation partner for night shift employees to trial an improved commute system that reduced tardiness. It sponsored scholarships that allowed night workers to complete certifications. It published manuals for other companies wanting to adapt their model. It did not promise a revolution, it offered replicable change. On a cool autumn evening, at a modest table near an open window, Daisy and William opened a letter from a small call center in another state that had piloted one of the Foundation's programs. The letter was handwritten. It was a simple account of someone finally finishing her degree. There was no fanfare, only the quiet evidence that something practical had been done, that systems had been improved, that someone's life had shifted by a series of deliberate steps. Daisy folded the letter and put it into a drawer with other notes. She looked up at William and, with the tired, contented face of someone who had done the work, said, "We built something that doesn't depend on my not being tired." He reached for her hand. "We built something that could outlast both of us," he replied. Their life was not an absence of difficulty. They were leaders of a company that still had to make fiscal choices and manage markets. They were married to each other and to a set of responsibilities neither had sought at first. But when Daisy thought back to the night at the gala, to the envelope with $5,000 folded into a pocket like a small question, she felt a gratitude that was pragmatic. The money had bought a night. It had not bought her future. She had chosen the future herself. The story was not, in the end, about the money alone. It was about choice and translation, the ability to turn unnoticed labor into recognized value, to convert empathy into scalable practice, to refuse being quiet in a room that needed to hear. It was also about what happens when two people who began with different tools of influence learn to measure success in the same units: dignity, continuity, and sustained impact. As the Foundation's gala wound down and guests read the stories on display, Daisy stepped away for a moment and looked over the room. There were faces she recognized: former trainees who now managed teams, a few board members who had been skeptical and now offered quiet compliments. She smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because the engine of change had been set in motion by a dozen small decisions made over time. When the night concluded, there was one last amenity that felt fitting. Instead of an expensive gift bag, the Foundation provided attendees with a small booklet, a practical guide to implementing people-forward policies, filled with spreadsheets, templates, and real-world costs. It had no glossy claims. It had work. Daisy signed a few copies and then stepped outside into the night with William. They walked, hands clasped, past the building where the original gala had been held years before, now just another lit space among many. "Do you ever regret taking that envelope?" William asked, half curious, half teasing. She considered the question and answered with the kind of clarity that had become her hallmark. "No," she said. "It was an opening. I could have closed it and taken the money and been fine. Instead, I chose to do the work." He nodded. "I could have hidden behind my balance sheet," he replied. "Instead, I learned to listen." For both of them, the lesson was simple and stubborn. Money could create opportunities, but it could not define a life. Choice did that. Their story, beginning with a paid date that stunned a gala, and moving through months of pilot work, a merger fight, a proposal, and a foundation, had become less about spectacle and more about method. It had shown that agency matters, that accountable leadership wins respect, and that dignity yields measurable returns. If the night's small celebrations were any guide, the future would be workmanlike and hopeful, filled with spreadsheets and stories, with late nights and incremental growth. Daisy had become, by choice, by work, by stubborn adherence to principle, a leader who could sit at the table not as an accessory, but as a maker of policy. William had become a partner who had learned that influence carries obligation. They walked on, past the lights, into a future that was work, promise, and the slow gathering of small wins. The envelope had been a hinge. What had swung open on that hinge was a life chosen and built, one careful decision at a time. Rate this story 0 to 10 and subscribe for more.